It's now 36 years since the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and yet the frightening consequences of the reactor accident are visible to this day. By this, we mean genetically modified animals, fungi that feed on radioactive radiation, and the ruins of a hospital where unspeakable suffering once took place. You want to know what bizarre secrets are still slumbering in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone? Then watch this video to the end. Before we get started, be sure to hit the like button and ring the notification bell for more great videos. Also, stick around until the end to learn about one of the most bizarre details of Chernobyl. Spiders. 30 years after the terrible nuclear catastrophe, biologist Rob Nelson and his colleague Marianne Ochota went to the Chernobyl area. There, the scientists wanted to find out how the long-term effects of radiation exposure affect the animals and nature. The researchers then looked for insects in the red forest. Many crawling animals were exterminated within this contaminated zone. Some species that managed to survive in turn showed malformations and other mutations. Since insects do not live very long, the genetic changes are already firmly anchored in the genome of the small animals. The spiders the two experts examined appeared to be normal at first glance, but unfortunately that was not the case. This was proven above all by looking at the spun webs. In contrast to healthy spiders, those from Chernobyl created distorted, deformed, and irregular structures. The spiders, which were under the influence of drugs and experiments, wove very similar structures. These types of webs directly impact the Chernobyl spider's chances of survival and could also point to genetic mutations. Hospital. After the nuclear disaster, it wasn't long before the hospital in Pripyat was overrun by countless patients. These were primarily those firefighters and helpers who were injured or exposed to high levels of radiation during their deployment. However, the hospital staff was completely overwhelmed with this rush, and in fact, nobody knew how to treat radiation sickness at all. As a rule, those affected stayed here for a day before being taken to Moscow. A doctor who was in Pripyat in 1986 later spoke of patients who complained of fever, vomiting, and hallucinations. Like all other buildings in the city, the hospital has become a surreal, lost place. The gowns, the ampules, and the surgical instruments still give an idea of the desperate struggle for survival that once took place here. Although much of the equipment was taken with the evacuation, some items are still in their original places. This includes, among other things, the X-ray machine, which is still in the corresponding room. In the basement of the building are the clothes that those affected wore when they arrived. In order to get rid of the irradiated things as quickly as possible in all the hustle and bustle, the staff didn't know what to do other than deposit them in the basement. Even today, the level of radiation in these hospitals is 4,000 times higher than normal. Fair. Today, the Pripyat Fair is more like a spooky ghost town than a place of fun and lightheartedness. The rusting rides and stalls bear witness to something that now seems unimaginable. Life once pulsated around Chernobyl. Originally, the fairground should have opened on May 1, 1986, 5 days after the reactor accident. However, in order to distract local residents from the disaster, the amusement park was supposed to open its doors as early as April 27th. Unaware of the devastating consequences of radiation exposure, many families took a leisurely stroll on the Ferris wheel or drove around in a bumper car. Red Forest. In our first point, we already told you that the researchers went to the so-called Red Forest for their investigations. But what is the background of this area actually all about? The 10-square-kilometer area owes its name to its red-brown color, which is due to the high radiation exposure. And even today, the Red Forest is one of the most heavily contaminated places on the entire globe. It's therefore all the more astonishing that the area has now become a refuge for countless wild animals. after human retreat, many wild boars, wolves, beaver, deer, and eagles settled here. Despite the deformities that some of the animals show, the region is now considered a kind of radiological reserve. When Russia invaded Ukraine earlier this year, Russian soldiers are said to have entered the area without protective clothing and even lived in radioactive trenches. Ghosts. How many people really lost their lives as a result of the catastrophe is not so easy to quantify. The corresponding numbers range from less than 50 to hundreds of thousands of deaths that can be linked to the reactor accident in the aftermath. In fact, some people are convinced that the souls of the dead still roam the restricted zone to this day. Of course, since this claim cannot be scientifically proven, the supporters of the ghost theory have to resort to other sources. In 1997, a nuclear physicist is said to have traveled to the restricted area. As he was taking radiation measurements in Reactor 4, he suddenly heard a blood-curdling cry for help. In fact, the voice seemed to come from the old reactor room, desperately asking for rescue, but that was not possible at all. In addition to a password, a handprint was also needed to get into this area at all, not to mention the alarm that would have been raised. And yet the expert was sure afterwards that the screams clearly came from the reactor room. Do you think the researcher really heard the cries of a restless soul back then? Feel free to let us know in the comments below. Liquidators. Quite a few liquidators should pay for their daring commitment with their lives. The workers pursued the eponymous goal of liquidating the released radiation. Among other things, they had to remove the irradiated rubble and the graphite blocks and build the gigantic concrete dome that later became known as the sarcophagus. Those who were deployed on the roof were only allowed to work 40-second shifts because of the enormous radiation exposure. So the liquidators ran out, threw down a shovel of debris, and immediately sprinted back. The men then received a certificate, 100 rubles, and were sent away. It's estimated that up to 800,000 liquidators were in action at the time, but by no means all of them were registered. According to an official World Health Organization report, the number of immediate fatalities is less than 50. However, other organizations consider this figure to be hopelessly understated and speak of at least 50,000 deaths. Stalker. For us, the reactor accident embodies a devastating tragedy that caused untold suffering. However, the so-called Chernobyl Stalkers have a somewhat different view of the dramatic events of the time. In detail, these are illegal groups that mostly consist of young men and have their very own symbols and rituals. The members keep secretly sneaking into the exclusion zone where they occupy abandoned apartments, read old Soviet literature, and even throw parties on the roofs. Some stalkers remain in the dangerous restricted area for up to 2 weeks at a time. Despite the high health risk, the men don't wear any protective gear and even drink the dirty water that's accumulated in the deserted cellars. But what actually moves the stalkers to romanticize this apocalyptic place in such a way? Some of them simply long for an adventure, for an adrenaline rush that everyday life cannot offer them. Others enjoy the lonely time away from many rules and even ascribe a sacred character to Chernobyl. Giant fish. The following video made headlines a few years ago. In the picture, we see a young man pulling a huge fish out of the water near Chernobyl. Apparently, the underwater creature weighed around 30 kilos and was about 1 meter long. However, it's unclear whether this enormous growth is due to the increased radiation exposure. Possibly, the animals simply have the chance to grow to such dimensions undisturbed in the hardly fished waters. In fact, unusually large catfish have also been sighted in the region. Gas masks. Derelict buildings, scattered everyday objects, and a seemingly endless supply of gas masks. There's no question that the area around Chernobyl resembles a terrifying ghost town these days. Each of these silent witnesses tells of the hustle and bustle that once took place here and of the apocalyptic events that were to follow. This also includes the vast heap of small gas masks that can still be found in the Pripyat kindergarten. Originally, the city of 50,000 inhabitants was to become the crowning glory of scientific progress. The families of engineers and workers were able to enjoy many amenities, including a cinema, a swimming pool, and the aforementioned fair. In fact, the residents, who were completely taken by surprise, were not evacuated until 30 hours after the reactor accident. A total of 325,000 people from the area had to leave their homes and never return. Black fungus. What still poses an enormous threat to humans, animals, and plants seems something of a welcome meal for a fungus. According to this, researchers found a fungus in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone that actually feeds on radioactive radiation. Since the black growth has an increased melanin content, it can absorb the radiation and convert it into chemical energy. The fungus could possibly also be used in future space missions. The scientists are currently testing whether it's also capable of shielding spaceships from harmful radiation in space. Russia kept it a secret. After the reactor had exploded, the Russian government was notified about how terrible the incident truly was. However, rather than take immediate action to get the nearby citizens to safety, the government decided to keep the story under wraps and do everything they could to keep it a secret. It would take several days for the surrounding areas to be evacuated after government officials finally admitted the true scope of the disaster. Prior to this, they did everything they could to sweep the incident under the rug, though in the end they were forced to admit defeat and own up to their mistakes. If you thought a few days was far too long for anyone to find out about the disaster, wait until you hear this. Other countries were not informed about what had taken place at all. You have to keep in mind that at the time, Russia and the United States were in the midst of the Cold War. Because of this, communication between the two countries was very limited. However, the United States aside, Russia didn't inform any other countries of what had taken place either. It would be quite a while later before several Swedish nuclear power workers noticed that a large amount of nuclear waste had been released into the environment. After learning about this, they alerted everyone to what was going on and before long found out what had taken place in Chernobyl. If it weren't for these researchers, we likely would have never known that the event ever happened. Day trips to Chernobyl. We're now left with the aftermath of Chernobyl more than 30 years after the incident took place. According to local laws, Chernobyl is officially off-limits to anyone who wished to live there permanently. However, for those who lived there before the nuclear fallout, the government has been much more relaxed about these rules, as is evidenced by Ivan and his former wife. However, even though no one is allowed to live in the area permanently, that hasn't stopped many explorers from visiting Chernobyl over the years. In fact, in 2011, just 25 years after the explosion, tourists began to flock to the area to catch a glimpse of what has essentially become a deserted wasteland. Tourists are allowed to make single-day trips into Chernobyl to take a look at the forgotten city. However, before they're allowed to enter, they're tasked with taking part in a decontamination procedure. They're also forced to wear protective clothing if they plan on getting close to the reactor. On top of this, they're also asked to decontaminate themselves once again after they leave the area to ensure that they don't take any radiation home with them. Since the tragedy took place, Chernobyl has remained largely untouched by human hands. Though in more recent years, the government hopes to bring in large amounts of money by hosting private tours to the area. In total, they estimated that around 100,000 people will begin to visit Chernobyl each year to get a better look at what happened on that fateful day all those years ago. What's quite scary about these tours is that guests are actually allowed to enter the control room in which everything went wrong, leading to the disaster more than 3 decades ago. In the past, this reactor was shielded by thick material to keep guests far away from any radioactive waste. However, for the last 2 years, guests have been allowed to enter the control room with only minimal protective equipment, including full-body protective gear. It seems that the government is doing the best it can to make something good out of a devastating situation by allowing people to venture into the area and take home memories that will last a lifetime. And now it's your turn. Given all the oppressive images and stories, what goes through your head? Just let us know in the comments below. Also, while you're at it, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for future updates on some of history's greatest tragedies. Until then, please take a look at the other posts on our channel, which we've linked for you here in the credits. And with that, thanks for watching, take care, and see you next time.